Yeah, I know that we got a shorter, well, not shorter, a smaller group today, and yeah, I mean, if anybody has any questions or they want to talk about some things, feel free to interrupt me, and we'll just have a chat. Like I have a presentation and some demos and stuff, but more than happy to have some conversations about all sorts of things. We can talk about .NET upgrades. We can talk about .NET AWS. We can talk about .NET Strawberry Shortcake, whatever it is, right? So more than happy to chat with with my lovely friends in Boston, which I was actually just in Boston a couple days ago. I was there for DevReach, which was at the Westin, so I got an opportunity to kind of check that out. Um, anyway, so if you don't know who I am, my name is Isaac Levin, and I'm a .NET developer advocate at AWS. And if you follow some of the .NET developer communities that are out there, like GitHub or Twitter or Twitch, you've probably seen me around. If you haven't, I've also, I think, I've presented a handful of times to this particular meetup, both in person and virtual. So if you're following along, again, ask some questions. And what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about what do you do with your old .NET Framework applications? Right? A really, really loaded topic as pertains to that. And maybe some people just shout out, like, what is the oldest version of .NET that you need to maintain today? Are we on 4.8? Are we on the latest? Are we on 4.5 or 4.0? Or, does anybody think that they have the lowest version of .NET they have to support?
4.6 for me.
4.6.
4.6.2.
All right. Well, 4.6.2 is not too old. I mean, I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's all pretty old. But whenever I do this talk in person, I have some swag to give away, and basically the person or the couple of folks that have like the oldest version, they get some swag. And I've definitely done this talk, and there's been people that still to this day have to maintain 1.1 applications that run in like a VM, which I think is exciting. That's the only way that I can really think of that. So with that, let's do this. Let's talk a little bit about where we are today. So if you haven't been following along with .NET in the last few years, the .NET that is today is substantially different than the .NET that you might be used to. So for instance, in the last 5 or 6 years, .NET, it does not need to run on Windows anymore. So if you think of .NET development over the last 20 plus years, .NET Framework's been around a long time. The idea is that there was always some deep-rooted tie into Windows, and now that's no longer the case. Now .NET is a cross-platform native and web UI framework, and it has support for all sorts of amazing performance and productivity improvements and cloud native and all these sort of things. And it's all made possible because of the work done by the team at Microsoft on the .NET team, as well as the developer community, to build that singular approach of like, we really want .NET apps to run anywhere. And when I mean anywhere, I truly mean anywhere, whether it be, obviously still on Windows or Linux servers or, Macs, Raspberry Pis. If you've bought a Samsung TV in the last few years, Tizen, which is the operating system that your TV uses, that actually you can run .NET apps on that. So, I mean, you can literally run .NET anywhere, which I think is a really exciting time for .NET developers. So, but the question then becomes like, how do we get to this point, right? We all know, the .NET of old, right? The Windows only, the having to do things like the GAC, having to do all sorts of crazy things with assemblies. And now we have this point in time where you can have multiple versions of .NET running on the same machine. And, how do we get to this point, right? So the first thing to talk about is at this top level, you had, the .NET framework again, like 20 plus years of development and was going along smoothly. Very, very successful businesses have built their entire companies on the backs of .NET framework. But one thing that happened, like I mentioned about 5 or 6 years ago, a little bit longer than that, actually, when the work started to be being done, is this idea of like, look, we are just focusing on Windows. This is the .NET team talking. Focusing primarily on Windows is not advantageous for us. We want .NET to be a place where anybody can build any sort of application. And they saw something, the work being done in the mono runtime, which is the box down at the bottom. The mono runtime, it was a non-Windows implementation of .NET that was built by a team of developers in the open source community that eventually created a company called Xamarin, which focused primarily on mobile development. So running .NET apps on phones, Android phone, iOS phone to be specific. And eventually, at a particular point in time, that company Xamarin was acquired by Microsoft. So what happens then at that point, right? So now Microsoft has 3 versions of .NET. They have the .NET Framework, they have .NET Core, which is this new way of thinking about building .NET applications, and then they have Xamarin, they have the Mono Runtime. And what do? They just say, let's merge them all together and call that .NET, right? Simple as that. Not really simple, but it goes to show you that it's the work of, all of the great improvements that have been made to .NET over the years in the framework, and making those sort of things available cross-platform using .NET Core, and then taking some of the great community work that's been done with the Mono Runtime and making one .NET, and that version today is .NET 6. For folks that might not be haven't been paying attention to .NET releases, so .NET 6 is the current version of .NET. It was released in November of last year, so 2021, and it's an LTS release, which stands for long-term support. And what that means is that you have .NET 6 support for 3 years after release, which means that at the end of 2024, you will have support for .NET. And actually, the great thing about .NET now is that it comes out every year. So now we're going to be in a position where every fall, every November timeframe, there's going to be a new version of .NET, and this fall it's going to be .NET 7, and that is a non-LTS release, or an STS release, short-term support. And basically what that means is it's a shortened life cycle. So the expectation is that folks will be on .NET 6. They can go to .NET 7 if they need to, or they can wait for .NET 8, which will come out in a few years. And by the time the .NET 6 runs off of support, which is like, I guess, 2024, we'll already have 3 or 4 new versions of .NET at that particular point, right? So you can rest assured that you're going to have .NET support for a while. And then some point down the road, .NET 35, or whatever the Angular or React versions are at now, like, you're still going to have that really, really great .NET developer experience. But what does this actually mean? As it pertains to, hey, I'm a developer, I'm building a application on .NET using .NET Framework. What does that mean to me? So at the end of the day, if you're using .NET Framework 4.8 today, you are going to get no new feature development. You're going to get only bug fixes, security patches, things like that. However, if you're on 4.8 or the latest version of 4.8, the .NET Framework, you can rest assured that you're going to have support for a while, because .NET Framework ships in Windows. And what that means is that as long as it's shipped in Windows, you're going to have support for it. So if you're on 4.6.2, like somebody was mentioning earlier, or even something older, getting into .NET Framework puts you in a position where you can continue to have that support, and you don't have to make if you don't have the resources available to you, you don't have to make that effort to go to .NET Core, even though there's a ton of great work going on in that space. So that's for .NET Framework. And now we're at this point where you have, a few years ago, you have .NET Core, you have Xamarin, and Microsoft had to make a decision. The .NET team had to make a decision. We're at .NET Core 3.1. The next version is .NET Core 4.0, and that's problematic for a lot of reasons. One, because naming is challenging. 2, because .NET 4 already exists, right? And I think that if anybody was to do a Google search, if there was a .NET Core 4.0, it'd be almost impossible to find the answers to some of the questions you're looking for. So what did the .NET team do? We have this great framework that we've built called .NET Core, and we have this great framework that we've acquired and grown in the Mono Runtime. Let's actually take the best of the Mono Runtime and the best of the .NET Core and merge them in together. And what does that become? .NET 5, which came out, like I said, in November of 2021. Or November 2020, sorry. So what does that actually mean? So we had .NET 5, and now, like I mentioned earlier, we're now at .NET 6, which includes, the best of .NET Core, the best of the Mono Runtime, bringing a lot of really valuable things like native AOT and things like that. And it really brings that next level of amazing experiences for .NET developers. One of the things that's really, really important to call out is that even though you're a .NET Framework developer, and maybe your programs or your applications that you're building might look similar, there are some things that you just can't do in .NET 6. And if anybody's been a .NET developer for a bit of time, like me, for instance, you look at some of the things that are in this purple box, right? So there's some component or app models that there is no suitable replacement or suitable porting story for .NET Framework to .NET 6. And the two biggest ones that I always like to call out is Web Forms and WCF. So if you're a Web Forms developer today, there's no path for you to get from Web Forms from .NET Framework to .NET 6, because Web Forms uses some paradigms that just don't work in .NET Core. And to be honest, there's better ways to build applications today. And the recommended replacement from Microsoft that they recommend is ASP.NET Blazor. So if you haven't paid attention with Blazor, I highly recommend. There's tons of content online about it. Basically, what it allows you to do is build single page applications or Web 2.0 applications, or things that you would typically have to build with something like JavaScript, like Angular, React, Vue, Next, what have you, right? But it allows you to build that entire front end, back end experience all in C#, which is an exciting opportunity to really focus on, being able to build one continuous thing. And there's all sorts of really great features and great experiences that you can build in Blazor. And I highly recommend, if you haven't seen some of it, to go ahead and take a look at it. The other one, like I mentioned, is WCF. And WCF is a bit of a more interesting story because there's kind of two decent replacements, right? Not decent is not the right word, two good replacements. So the first one being gRPC, which is the preferred approach if you listen to the .NET team, and gRPC stands for Remote Procedure Calls. So it's a new way to interact with services, in a similar how you would do it with WCF. RPC is a little bit different, but at the end of the day, you're going to get the same end user experience. You're going to be able to consume APIs and have them discoverable and things like that. There is another option as well, which I think is actually pretty interesting, and that is actually Core WCF, which is a community-led project. Tons of people in the developer community, people at AWS, people at Microsoft are contributing to it as well. And even though it is not officially supported as a replacement, I think that it's a really, really interesting option, especially if you like the way that you build apps with WCF. Being able to take a look at that same sort of concepts and just be able to get access to some of the productivity improvements coming from .NET 6. One thing that's really, really important to call out as well is what is different between .NET Framework and .NET 6. And if you've, had the opportunity to build, like go to Visual Studio and file a new project inside Visual Studio, and you take a look at the CS proj or the VB proj file in Visual Studio, which you can actually do in .NET 6. You can't do that in .NET Framework. You notice that the project file, the project definition file, is substantially simplified. And the reason why that is because the .NET team wanted to make a considered effort to go to a more standardized approach to how we can define and how we configure projects. And the biggest thing that I think is important to call out is the fact that the framework names, or the ways, or the typical platforms that we're going to publish or target for .NET development, and they're more simplified. So in essence, if you build a .NET 6 application today, the target framework for it is going to be .NET 6.0. And what that includes everything from .NET Core App, which is the target framework for .NET Core, as well as .NET Standard, which is the framework for .NET Standard. We'll talk about .NET Standard in a bit, but it's important to know that all the .NET 6 is everything that's in .NET Core App and .NET Standard, and then some extras on top. And if you need to build applications that run on different devices or different platforms, you can utilize target framework monikers, or TFMs, to really specify and get that OS specific functionality that you're looking for. So for instance, if you're building a WinForms or a WPF app today, it'd be .NET 6.0-Windows, and that gets you access to all those Windows APIs. And then if you're doing things like Android or iOS development, you can add the specific moniker for those particular things. And this is kind of a graphic or a visual explanation of what I just said, right? So everything that's in this blue box, that netx.y, it includes everything from .NET Core App 3.1, which is the latest and last version of .NET Core, as well as .NET Standard 2.1, which is the last version of .NET Standard. And then if you need to get specific OS-specific functionality, you can take a look at some of those orangish brown boxes where you specify that moniker at the end. But what's important to really think about is when we're consuming libraries that have been built by Microsoft, and what is Microsoft targeting when they build these new packages? So if you're building apps today and you're taking advantage of cross-platform libraries like ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework, System.link, or Systems.collections.generic, like those libraries and packages that we're all familiar with using, the target framework for those are going to be .NET 6.0. Also, if you're going to be taking advantage of some features that are Windows specific, the moniker for that, a target framework for that, is 6.0-Windows. If you're building apps that are taking advantage of Xamarin Forms or Essentials or .NET MAUI, which is a cross-platform native UI framework, if you haven't taken a look at that, please do. That is also going to be framework, our .NET 6.0 target framework. And then finally, the most important thing that I like to call out is if you're consuming cross-platform libraries that you need .NET Framework support as well as .NET 6, the target framework for those are going to be Net Standard 2.0, and that's like SQL.data client and things like that, right? So the question then becomes like, what should you target if you're building projects? So today, if you are building an application or you're building a library that needs to be consumed by both a .NET Framework application as well as a .NET 6 application, you can use .NET Standard 2.0. And what .NET Standard is, if you're not familiar, is that it's a specification or a contract that identifies and makes available a ton of APIs based on particular platforms support. And how it works is the higher the number you go as it pertains to version of .NET Standard, the more APIs that you have access to. But the downside to that is the higher the number, the less platforms that you can actually target. So for instance, if you're comparing like .NET Standard 1.6 versus .NET Standard 2.0, you're going to have more API availability or API surface in 2.0, but you're going to have more platforms that are supported on 1.6 because, you know, as you add more and more APIs, there's less cross-platform functionality. So if you're building that today and you need to have a library that's consumed by .NET Framework, .NET Standard 2.0 is probably the way to go. If you're building apps that are, you know, consumed by a .NET Core 3.1 application or Xamarin or something for Mono, but nothing .NET 6 related, you might want to take a look at .NET Standard because there's a couple of additional features and enhancements and APIs that have been made available for the .NET Standard API or specification that can maybe bring some value there. But the biggest thing that I want to call out is if you're building a .NET 6 application, and that's all it is. So .NET 6 web application, maybe some .NET 6 class libraries, all of those projects can be .NET 6, your class libraries, your desktop projects, your web projects, what have you, right? And then you can use those for code sharing moving forward. All right, so I imagine that what's probably on most of your folks' minds is, hey, like the title of your talk is like, what do I do with my old .NET Framework applications? And you just spent 25 minutes talking about, you know, the history of .NET to this point and where we are today and what we should be doing as it pertains to targeting projects. But I was really hoping to get some value as it pertains to like what I should do when I go about the process of upgrading my .NET Framework application. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit now. I'm going to go through, in my opinion, what a really typical workflow should be for going through that story from .NET Framework to .NET 6. And the first step being preparation. So I think it's really, really important to call out is that you probably have a ton of dependencies that you just can't go from .NET Framework to .NET 6. Maybe you have some NuGet packages or some loose DLLs. Maybe you're taking reference of some front-end dependencies or different .NET Framework APIs. Those probably will need to be modified in some capacity. So what's really important is to assess or build a really rich I guess, breakdown of what's going on with your .NET Framework application and all the impact that's going to need to happen, or all the changes that need to happen that's going to impact how long it takes. And there are some really, really valuable tools for this. So I mentioned, you know, the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a command line based tool from the team at Microsoft, from the .NET team, to really walk us through like an interactive story of analyzing or even upgrading our applications. And then if you prefer more graphical interfaces, the porting system for .NET from AWS actually walks you through that same process, but, you know, has some graphs and charts, and we'll show a little bit of demo of that at the end. So after you've gotten like a really, really rich assessment story, you've kind of built out, hey, these are all the changes I'm going to need to make. These are all the dependencies that are going to have to get updated. Then you can actually use those tools that I mentioned earlier, you know, the upgrade assistant or the porting system for .NET, and actually run them, import them. So it's a really, really exciting story because you have that ability to kind of cancel out some of that low-hanging fruit that you might not be aware of as you go through that migration journey. But I can tell you right now, if you do step 2, and you should do it in another branch because we don't want to block other people on our team or ourselves if we're going through our typical development tasks, your app's probably not going to build, right? If you just port a project from .NET Framework to .NET 6 today, and without making some coding changes or some configuration changes, more than likely, you're going to have to go back into Visual Studio and get your code to build. So looking at error warnings and checking your NuGet packages, references, and all that sort of great stuff, like all the work needs to get done in that step. And if you get to a point where, hey, my code builds, maybe it runs a little bit locally, then you have the opportunity to make sure that all of your test cases are working effectively and making sure your test projects are .NET 6 as well. and then deploying it potentially to a lower level environment where you can get more smoke testing, user acceptance testing, and that's really the flow, right? I know depending on how big your solutions are, this can take less time or way longer time, right? But it's really important if you compartmentalize all these steps into individual items of work or functions of work, it's substantially less daunting than you think, right? And like I said, if you're, depending if you're going from an MVC project, which has a really good porting story to .NET 6, or a web forms project maybe doesn't have as great of a story, your mileage may vary. But it's important to think about it in this sort of construct to really understand how we can be successful. And if we're taking a look at kind of that step 3, right, where we're fixing our code and building, or maybe we're upgrading, right, there's some things that we're going to have to take a look at as it pertains to what we can reuse versus what we can rewrite. And what I like to say is that if you have an application today that have, like most applications, you're identifying some, you're consuming some data sources, you're having some custom business logic, maybe you're doing some logging in, or you have some third-party dependencies, you can reuse probably most of that code. And my recommendation always is if you can get that code and put it into a class library, and then over the course of time you're going through this process, even like ASP.NET controllers and views and models, if you're building MVC apps, you then have a situation where it's, hey, like I have some class libraries, I have everything that I can reuse, but then I have a project, and the only thing that's left over is what I need to rewrite. And most of the things that you need to rewrite are pretty self-explanatory. Like if you have global ASAX and the default startup code for ASP.NET, like that code is not going to come along for the ride. Or if you have advanced MVC configuration, or if you're using things like configuration manager to manage like settings. HTTP modules is another one. And then obviously, if you're using some component types like we talked about earlier, web forms or WCF, more than likely you'll need to rewrite those to some capacity. So what are some tools that we can actually use to help our lives a bit, right? I talked a little bit about the upgrade assistant for .NET. And I think one thing that's really, really important is to talk about, especially, if you really need rich user interface tools or rich reporting, the porting assistant for .NET from AWS, which is a free tool, open source on GitHub. It comes in 2 flavors. It has a standalone tool, which is an application that runs on Windows, and you also have a Visual Studio 2019 or 2022 extension. And what the porting assistant does, it'll actually walk you through an assessment as well as a potential port of your applications from .NET 3.5 all the way up to .NET 6 and .NET Core 3.1 if you need to go there. It supports MVC and class libraries, as well as it makes some consolidated effort to look at WCF and move over to core WCF. And you're probably thinking, well, it's not an officially supported a replacement or porting story. And we at AWS, we think that core WCF is a really solid approach for if people want to stay with WCF. So we're giving it as an option. If you want to stay in WCF, there's a community-led project that has a ton of visibility and a ton of interest. We should be looking to do things like that. It also do some things like it'll take your web forms applications and start to recommend ways to port it to Blazor. It's not going to do a direct like web forms to Blazor port for you, but it'll actually identify a lot of things to make your life a bit easier. And there's a ton of other interesting things that are coming in the future. And at the end of this talk, I'll have a short link where we can actually, I'll share out like the link to this deck, as well as links to the porting assistant and the upgrade assistant, as well as some really exciting things as it pertains to migration, best practices, and things like that. So with that, let's do a demo. Who wants to see a demo? I want to see a demo. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a command line. Let me just zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to go into, I should have done this before, but we'll figure it out. All right. So I'm inside a class library or a WinForms application that I have. It's a simple matching application. There's nothing really exciting about it, but it's a WinForms app. And if I take a look at, for instance, let me just go to this project file. So as you can see here, it is a WinForms project, .NET Framework 4.5. And what I want to do with the .NET Upgrade Assistant, the command line-based utilities, I want to actually upgrade this application and its attached class library. So there's a class library tied to it as well. I want to upgrade this to .NET 6. So how would I go about doing that? So again, like I mentioned a bit earlier, so I am in the solution file for this particular application. And what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to go upgrade assistant. If I can type. And then I'm going to go upgrade, which is the command to use, and I'm going to point it at my solution file. And what it's going to do is it's actually going to walk us through step by step of all the things that it'll want to do to upgrade our apps. And we'll actually follow along inside of Visual Studio Code as well. And while this is loading, all right, so the first thing that it wants to do is it's going to ask for a specific entry point. So, hey, where do we want to start this upgrade at? So I'm going to specify selecting entry point, and then I'm going to select which project I want to start on, which in this case is the matching game project, which is that WinForms application. And the first thing that it does is it's going to assess stuff, and it's going to say, okay, this is the project you want to upgrade. And then it's going to say, wait, this project has a dependency on another project. So we recommend that you start with that project first, and that's that matching game.logic class library. So I'm going to start there, and then it's going to list out all the steps that it's going to take to actually upgrade this particular class library to a .NET 6 compatible project. So the first thing that it wants to do is it's going to want to apply a step to back up my project. I never back up projects because I am crazy like that. And I'm going to go to this next step, which is converting our project file to the SDK style. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that the project files are substantially different between .NET Framework applications and .NET 6. So one of the things that it's going to do is it's going to actually convert it to that SDK style, and we'll do that. And while it's doing that, let's actually take a look and see after it's complete what that change looks like, right? So if I open up in Visual Studio Code here, and let's just minimize this. So everything on the left-hand side is what this class library used to look like. So as you can see, there's about 49 lines, and the new ported version is 11. And as you can see here, the target framework is still net 45 because we're not done yet. But it just shows you how substantially more simplified these project files are, which that's pretty exciting. And the next thing it's going to want to do is it's going to say, okay, we're going to run some analyzers on your project. And what an analyzer is because there's a lot of logic that goes into this story, right? Like if you're doing this, you need to do this. And if you're making this change, we're going to do this change. So all of those analyzers are actually built into these NuGet packages. So what it's going to do is it's going to add those NuGet packages to our project. And then it's going to run some assessments. So for instance, transitive reference analyzer and things like that. The next step it wants to do is it's going to want to update our TFM, our target framework moniker. So that's going to go from, .NET Framework 4.5 to something else. And it recognizes, so your updated TFM is Net Standard 2.0 because you're consuming this class library from a .NET Framework 4.5 application. So we're going to upgrade it to Net Standard 2.0 so it can still be used. So if you take a look, now, the target framework is now Net Standard 2.0, which I think is pretty cool. And then we're going to continue through this, and now we're done with that particular class project. So now it says, okay, let's go on to the next one. The matching game.logic project is done. So now let's go to the WinForms application. And this is a bit more involved, obviously, because WinForms, it's something a bit like there's more things to consider because you're building an app that runs with a UI on the client. So that's just a class library. But the processes and the steps are all the same. So let's actually step over this backup project because YOLO. And then we're going to do that same thing. We're going to convert that project to the SDK style. And let's do that. And then we're going to run some of those analyzers. Let's do those too. And then while this is running, let's actually hop over and take a look at what our project looks like now. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, that's WinForms project and what it used to look like, 89 lines, and now we're at 19 lines. This project still isn't going to build because we're still target framework net 45. But if I keep going and run some more of these, it's going to want to update the TFM. And that update TFM is recommended 6.0-Windows because the project either has Windows-specific dependencies or builds on WinExe. And then if you take a look at that, it updates that. It uses the use Windows Forms property inside of CSproj, and the target framework is now Net 6.0-Windows, which is pretty cool. And that's going to start running some more compatibility tests to actually start looking at some of our other files, not just a project file. So looking at some configuration files we might have, even some source code, and look to add pieces of functionality that are needed to run on newer versions of Windows. For instance, it needs to add the new default font API alert, as well as adding some of the new high DPI settings that the new version of Windows requires. So we're going to start to do some of those things, and that's when it's going to start to update some source code. So if I go to the next step here, hit next. And then once this is done, we're going to see that, okay, well, it's upgrades our config files, and then it's going to do our update our source code as well. And then once this is done, we can actually take a look at some of the changes that it made. And in this particular case, it hasn't made a ton, but it just goes to show you that it will update source code if you need it to, and it's based on certain criteria. So as you can see here, we're waiting for this page to load all the way down. Now we're on to this next project. And let's actually move to the next project, and let's finalize the upgrade, right? So there's no state that needs to get saved. And if I look here, I have the only change that it made was in program.cs, and it added high DPI mode, system aware, because in this particular case, it's going to run on Windows, so it needs to be DPI aware. So let's go back to our console. All right, so let's minimize this, and let's go into that matching game. So we're still in that matching game project now, which is a WinForms application. And if I .NET run here, what's actually going to do is it's actually going to build our project, our .NET 6 project, and it's going to run it. So as you can see here, this is an application, a WinForms application to be exact. That's just a simple card matching game. So nothing super exciting, but it just goes to show you, and I got a match here, so that's exciting. You can take a .NET Framework application, 4.5 to be exact, and go from .NET Framework to .NET 6 with the upgrade system, which I think is pretty cool. So that is that tool. So again, like that's one tool to do the job, and I want to show you another tool as well that can help you be more successful. And that tool is the porting assistant for .NET. I'm going to do a quick pause here. Is there any chat? No chat. Cool. All right. So in this situation, this particular tool, like I mentioned, it's the porting system for .NET from AWS, and it's a graphical tool. There's this standalone version, which I'm showing you here. There's also a version inside of Visual Studio. And what it actually does is it actually allows you to point it at solutions and assess those solutions and give you a rich output of those particular things. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So right here, I have the NLP Commerce project, which if you're not familiar, it's a open source e-commerce platform that you can actually go out to GitHub today. And if you need an e-commerce platform or an e-commerce solution for your business, you can get that code from GitHub and you can use it as inspiration to build an e-commerce presence for your business today. But when you assess a solution, it actually gives you a really handful of valuable information right from the get-go. So an assessment overview page where it showcases all the NuGet packages that are incompatible, as well as APIs and if there's build errors. And then it'll actually list all the individual projects that exist and all the specific information relating to those. I also have the ability at the solution level to drill in and see like a hierarchical representation of all the project dependencies. So for instance, I can actually then take a look and say, okay, well, I probably shouldn't upgrade the NOP.core project first because that's going to break all of these other projects in the process. So it gives you the opportunity to look to see how all these different projects are interconnected and then choose a project when you go through that porting exercise that's not going to affect the entire solution all at once. And I also have that ability to drill into each of these individual services. So for instance, I can drill into this NOP.services project and again, see all these NuGet packages that are listed out and what the suggested replacement for, if they're compatible or not, if they reference to particular source files. I can then go and look and see if there's any APIs to call or source files. Let me go to a different one that actually has some more information. Let's go to this NOP core project. So as you can see here, I have some source files and APIs. And it actually lists out like, oh, you're making use of stackexchange.redis, and that's compatible, and that's the latest version of it. You're also using these other projects as well. And, you know, some of them are going to work and some of them are not. And then you can actually go into some of your source code and point out like which source code has the most incompatible API calls. So in this particular one, it'll tell you, oh, this is an incompatible method invocation. So you can't use memory cache in this particular or object cache in this particular state. And depending on what you're trying to do, it'll actually give you other information. So if it's actually going to port something, it'll say, oh, we're porting from this to this, and this might be a change that's needed. It also mentions deprecated methods and things like that. So there's a ton of really valuable information in here. And you can go through this entire process and look at all these different source files and really build a rich story. So when you go and actually start that upgrade step or that porting journey, you know exactly what you're going to have to do. You know all of the interlocking details of what's going on here and what you can do to be successful. But I'm going to tell you right now, if I was to try to port this project, if I was to click this port solution button, my project more than likely wouldn't build. So let's actually look at an example of actually taking a .NET Framework application, our .NET Framework project, and porting it to .NET 6 and actually being able to use it in a .NET 6 application. So for that particular case, I'm using the newtonsoft.json project. So if you're not familiar with that, it's the most downloaded NuGet package in existence. And what it, to grossly summarize what it can do is it helps you serializing and deserializing JSON. So for instance, if you are making lots of interactivity between APIs, if you're interacting with different JSON structured files, it's a great project to be able to add that compatibility to, or that capability to your application. And as you can see here, it's a Net 45 project, and there's a couple of incompatible APIs, and there's some reference projects and things like that. And I can actually click this port button, and it'll actually say, okay, where do you want this destination? Where do you want this project ported to? And then the target framework. And if I click port here, it's actually going to go through that process similar to the upgrade assistant and start to make some of those high-level changes, doing the same thing, looking at analyzers, looking at different conditions and things like that. Depending on the size of the project, the port process does take a little bit of time. So in the essence, in respect to time, I'd already ported a version of this right before this talk. And I'm in Visual Studio, and let's actually just test out taking this particular project that I just ported and making use of it in a .NET 6 application. So let's actually create a new project here. Let's create a new project, and let's just create a console application. Wait for Visual Studio to load, initialize my templates. Waiting for the spinning wheel to go away, and then I'm going to specify a console application. Double click on that. All right, specify a project name, and then I can say, I want to use the Net 6 version, the long-term support version of .NET. Just click create. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a top-level statement formatted .NET application or .NET console application. So as you can see here, all there is a console.island here. And let's make that go away. Also, just because in this solution we want to make reference to that new project that we just ported, let's actually add an existing project. Let's point to that project that we just actually ported. So go to existing application, existing project. In my demos folder, I have this ported project, or ported folder, and then I specify this newtonsoft.json project. And if I open this up, as you can see here, the target framework is Net 6.0, and the target SDK is that new SDK style. And then there's some reference assemblies that were used earlier as going through the porting exercise. So let's actually just take a look and build out a little test of validating that newtonsoft.json is going to work running in .NET 6. So let's actually create a new list. Visual Studio is giving me some errors. That's great. Let's do a list of string. And that list of string is going to be just foo and bar. So nothing super exciting. I just have a list, or I'm sorry, I just have a list of strings, right? And inside the strings, there's two items in that list, and it's of foo and bar. So what I want to be able to do is I want to actually create a new variable, and we'll call that new variable JSON because I'm very sophisticated with my variable names. And I want to actually use the JSON convert to deserialize or to serialize this particular project or this particular object that I just created into JSON. So let's actually console.writeLine JSON. And then just for grins, let's actually create another list just to test the deserialization of that. And that is going to be JSON convert. And that's deserialize object, look at IntelliCode doing all that work for me. And then I'm just going to do a console.readLine just to keep our console window open. All right. Sweet. So what is this code actually doing? Nothing really exciting, but I have a .NET object, a .NET variable called list, and I serialize that list into a string representation of that list in a variable called JSON. I'm going to write that string out into the console. So it'll be a stringified or a JSON representation of this particular list. And I'm going to convert, or I'm going to deserialize that JSON object or that JSON string back into a list of strings. And then hopefully this magically works. So when I click run, what we should see on the console window is the string representation of that list variable that we created, that list object that we created. And there we go. So I know that's a very, very silly demo, but it shows you that you can take, using the porting assistant for .NET from AWS, you can take a .NET Framework 4.5 application or a class library, and you can actually port it to .NET 6, and then you can reference that project that you just ported in a .NET 6 console application. And again, with these two tools, the options are pretty limitless of what you can accomplish. And, that's kind of what I had for this. And I hope that you got some value out of it. I want to have an opportunity to have, a longer conversation with folks if you have any. And, this was great and I enjoyed the time, and thank you so much. And I'll paste a link. Actually, let's just do this. Let's actually paste a link to this in the chat. So if people want to follow along, they can use it. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing my screens because the only thing that was on the screen was that short link. But yeah, like, if anybody's curious, come off mute and we can, have a conversation about .NET Framework apps. If you think that any of the tools that I showed, there was some value there, if the tools that you saw you have questions about, yeah, let's just have a conversation for as long as you folks want. Or you can quietly say to yourself how terrible the presentation of this was and slowly hang up. Your choice.
Hey, hi, this Tejas here. It's a good presentation.
Yeah, that was excellent. I'm just tweeting them, so sorry, I'm busy.
No,
thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just gonna put your link in the tweet.
So one question I have is, I know I missed a little bit of it in middle when you were showing the .NET Upgrade Assistance UI, the ASP.NET version. Is about the NuGet references. So like we have inherited some projects where the references are to not just simple NuGet libraries, but a very heavy project, like for example, Castle Windsor for dependency injection, or for nhibernate for ORM. So, any experience from whatever you have done so far in terms of how does the upgrade tool deal with such heavy libraries? I mean, does it provide any recommendation, or it's just up for pure rewrite?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if you got an opportunity to look at so depending on what tool you use, you have definitely a different experience, right? So one is a command line based utility.
Correct.
So the command line based utility, like I said, it's a command line based tool. If you run the analyze command against a particular solution, it'll give you a file to output, but that file is going to be in a particular format called serif, which there's a way for you to view serif files, but it'll list out very, very similar, very plainly, like what needs to change and what some of the things that you need to accomplish are. If you use the porting assistant for .NET, it goes one step further and it actually tells you, like, this is a potential upgrade, NuGet package that you'll need to that you might need to upgrade. These are potentially some of the API calls that are not going to work, and things like that. So it builds so that, in my opinion, the assessment or the analyze phase for the porting assistant is pretty solid. Like it gives you a really strong understanding of what all the things you'll need to do as you go through that porting journey. And like I mentioned, so the porting system for .NET, like right now, it supports MVC projects, it supports class libraries, it supports WCF applications. It'll recommend ways for you to port to core WCF. It also does web forms and gives you kind of opportunities to look to port to Blazor. But at the end of the day, it really depends on how complicated your solutions are. But I think the most important thing is that these are tools to help you in that first step, that preparation step that I was talking about. And if you want to use them to upgrade and port, you definitely can. But there's going to be at some particular point in time, you're going to have to modify some code. And the biggest takeaway that I have from it, if you prepare yourself effectively and compartmentalize all these different things, you'll set yourself up for success. So I hope that answer your question. I mean, if you have questions about like particular libraries or things like that, like I haven't done an exhaustive thing of going through all of the different libraries that you could potentially need to thing. Like I think you mentioned Bounce Castle, right? So some might work and some might not, right? It all depends on what those projects are doing and if they're leveraging pieces of Windows, right? Like if you have a project or that's, for instance, if it's hitting the registry, that's never going to port to .NET 6.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So, that's one important thing to call out. Like and, back to the conversation that we're having at the beginning, like you don't need to port to .NET 6. You don't need to. If you can get to .NET Framework 4.8, you can rest assured that you're going to have support for as long as .NET ships in Windows. So at the end of the day, if you can't take on the effort to go to .NET 6, like it's not the most exciting thing ever, but it'll at least set you set up for you're not depending on Stack Overflow or MSDN forms that are really, really old for your support.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Anybody have anything else? I'm curious to know what people's thoughts are about the tools that I showed. Like, have you seen those tools before in action? Would you be curious about using those tools if you have .NET Framework apps today and you're looking to kind of build that assessment story?
Yeah, for me, I've not seen this tool so far, but I'm going to use them for sure. Probably try out something tonight itself. I've been struggling figuring out my upgrade path for around, more than 6 months. Like, I want to get out. We have like 4.5, .NET 4.5, we gradually upgrade to 4.6, but, we know that we still have a lot of catch up to do. But this is a really good tool. I will definitely give it a try.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, special, and all I can speak for is because I work with the team very closely, the team that built the porting system for .NET from AWS. And I can tell you right now, there's a huge effort in helping customers at least have some, building that really rich knowledge base of what it takes to upgrade. We understand that migration and modernization are sometimes the most challenging things that a developer might have to go through, especially a .NET developer. And if we can provide tools that help enable folks to get to where they should be or where they want to be, like, we're winning. Like I said, the porting system it's on GitHub. It's free. You don't need to sign up for an AWS account to use it. You don't need to pay for AWS services to use it. It's just a free tool available to the .NET community in order to help folks get from where they want or where they are to where they want to be.
Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else have any other comments, questions, concerns?
No, I just want to say really thank you. I don't know what my future holds for me because I know I'm going to do some ASP.NET to at least React, but I kind of want to be more prepared to what's out there. So at least I can make an intelligent suggestion or decision. So no, for me, it's very, very helpful.
Yeah. And definitely if anybody has any questions or want to chat more about this sort of stuff, like, I'm pretty active on Twitter, pretty active on all sorts of places. So definitely welcome any conversations that folks might have. All right. It looks like Renee is typing frantically. So hopefully we'll give them the opportunity to get their question out there. And yeah, I mean, it's great. It's always nice chatting with my friends from Boston. So I appreciate everybody's time, and hopefully we'll get to a point where we'll have in-person events, and maybe I'll come and speak with you all. And I believe this will be recorded. Jason, I don't know about when and how and where, but I know for a fact this was recorded because I got a notification saying it was being recorded. So it'll be put somewhere, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I'll post it up on the YouTube channel probably this evening, not tomorrow. I'll make sure I link you in the tweet so you can echo it out.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for doing this, man.
No worries.
Too bad it didn't end up being in person.
Yeah, no. So for a little bit of inside baseball, we were trying to get this session in person, and it just unfortunately didn't work out. But hopefully next time.
Definitely.
Awesome. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just posted a survey out on Twitter to see what the results are of people who really want to do in-person meetings versus not these days. Curious.
Yeah, I mean, I am too. Like, you know, I think as a part of my job, like it's very like speaking at events and speaking at meetups is a very, very critical part of that. So, you know, if folks want to go back in person, if folks have concerns, if folks don't want to, like we were talking about a bit earlier, like leave their house at 6 p.m. to go to a meetup, you know, definitely, you know, respond to Jason's survey because it's always really good information. So that's all I got. I mean, I want to thank everybody for the time. And again, if you are curious to want to chat with me more about all sorts of .NET topics, AWS topics, you can reach out to me on Twitter, Isaac R. Levin. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening, all my friends in Boston. Take care.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay, bye.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.